The chamber was enormous. It could hold 10,000 beings from 200 different worlds, and on most days it did. The walls were made of a crystal that changed color with the mood of the room. Right now, the crystal was pale and cold, the color it turned when the council had already made up its mind before anyone spoke. Ambassador Lena Vasquez stood at the center platform. She was a small woman by human standards, with short dark hair and eyes that had not slept well in weeks. She had prepared her speech for 11 days. She had memorized every law in the Conclave Charter. She had brought data, records, and proof of the Dracorvian threat. She had brought everything except the one thing that actually mattered in that room, the Council's willingness to care. She spoke for 20 minutes. She told them that the Dracorvian hegemony had moved warships to the edge of human space. She told them that 14 star systems and 40 billion human lives were at risk. She told them that the Conclave Charter had a defense clause, that any member species under military threat had the right to collective protection. She said all of this clearly, without emotion, because she had been told that the Council respected logic over feeling. When she finished, High Arbiter Sorrel looked at her the way a person looks at a broken machine, with mild interest and no real concern. He was tall, with 4 arms and a voice that sounded like wind moving through dry grass. He thanked her for her presentation. Then he called the vote. 214 members of the Galactic Conclave voted that day. 211 of them abstained. 3 voted in favor of defending humanity. The motion failed. Sorrel had the result entered into the official record with a note that read, "The human civilization presents a statistically low probability of long-term survival regardless of current conflict. Defense expenditure is not recommended at this time." That sentence was transmitted to every human-controlled planet, station, and ship within 6 hours. Lena Vasquez read it standing in a corridor outside the chamber. She read it twice. Then she folded the paper. She still used paper, an old habit, and put it in her jacket pocket. She walked to the communications office and sent one message to Sol Command on Earth. The message had 4 words: "We are on our own." Then she did something that surprised the Council's observers who were watching her through security feeds. She did not cry. She did not look angry. She sat down, removed her ambassador's badge, placed it carefully on the desk, and stared at the wall for exactly 3 minutes. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and went to re-enlist in the Sol Defense Force. The Council had made its first mistake that day, though they did not know it yet. Along with rejecting the defense vote, Sorrel had pushed through a secondary motion that barred humanity from accessing the Conclave's shared defense lattice, the most advanced military coordination network in the known galaxy. The official reason was that humans posed a security risk. The real reason was simpler. The Council did not think humans were worth the access codes. What the Council did not understand, what they had never bothered to understand in the 40 years humanity had been a member, was what happens when you tell a human they cannot have something they need. They build it themselves. Admiral Dara Osimensa received Vasquez's message in a bunker beneath Titan, Saturn's largest moon. The bunker was cold and smelled of machine oil and coffee. She had been expecting the message. She had, in truth, been expecting it for 3 years. She had already begun making plans. She gathered her engineers, 41 of the best technical minds in human space, and she told them what she needed. She needed a military coordination network that the Conclave could not access, could not monitor, and could not shut down. She needed it to be faster than anything the Dracorvians had. She needed it in 6 months. Her lead engineer, a young man named Tors who wore the same worn-out jacket every single day, looked at his team. His team looked back at him. Then he turned to the admiral and said, "We'll need more coffee." They got to work. What followed was 6 months that no one outside that bunker would fully know about for years. The engineers worked in shifts. They slept on cots between consoles. They argued, failed, rebuilt, and argued again. 3 of them quit and came back the next morning without saying a word about it. They called the project IRONWEB, and they built it from nothing. No conclave templates, no borrowed architecture, no outside help. Every line of it was human-made. Meanwhile, the Dracorvian hegemony was moving. Their warships were large, dark, and very old. The hegemony had been fighting wars for 600 years, and their ships showed it. They were covered in layered battle armor, each layer representing a different conflict, a different species they had conquered. They were confident. They had beaten 32 civilizations before this one. Most of those civilizations had been much older than humanity. Fleet Commander Vethkara stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the star maps of human space. He had studied humans for 2 years before accepting this command. He found them strange, too emotional, too divided among themselves, too short-lived to develop real strategic patience. They had spent most of their history fighting each other. They had dozens of languages, thousands of belief systems, and political systems that changed every few years. To him, they looked like a species that had never truly unified. A species like that, he believed, would fall apart when real pressure came. He was not wrong about what humanity had been. He was completely wrong about what humanity was becoming. Back in the bunker on Titan, Admiral Osai stood before her engineers on the final day of testing. IRONWEB ran clean. It was faster than anything in the Conclave's network. It was distributed across 11 hidden nodes that would continue operating even if 9 of them were destroyed. It could not be hacked from outside human space because it used an encryption method that Tors had invented himself and told no one outside the room. Osai looked at the display, then she looked at her team. They were tired, they were thin, they were grinning like they had just won something. "Good work," she said. "That was all, it was enough." The Dracorvians launched their first wave 6 weeks later. They did not know about IRONWEB. They did not know what was waiting for them. They came in confident, organized, and completely prepared for a war against the humans they thought they knew. They had no idea who they were actually fighting. The intelligence file arrived at Dracorvian High Command in a secure diplomatic packet routed through a conclave intermediary. It was labeled Human Military Capability Assessment, compiled from conclave observation data. It was 47 pages long. It covered everything: fleet numbers, weapon classifications, supply chain weaknesses, psychological profiles of senior commanders, projected morale collapse timelines, and a full breakdown of what the analysts called humanity's critical failure points. It was detailed, cross-referenced, and looked completely legitimate. High Arbiter Sorrel had authorized its transfer personally. His reasoning was simple. The war between humans and the Dracorvian hegemony was becoming disruptive to trade routes near the outer sectors. Several council members had complained. The fastest way to end the disruption was to end the war quickly. If the Dracorvians had accurate information, they could strike the right targets, break human resistance early, and a ceasefire could be arranged within months. The council would look like reasonable peacekeepers. Everyone would benefit. Everyone, of course, except the humans. But Sorrel had already decided they were not going to last much longer regardless. This was the second mistake. It was far worse than the first. What Sorrel did not know, what no one on the Conclave had known for 31 years, was that humanity's intelligence division had been watching the Council's observation network since almost the beginning of their membership. They had discovered early on that Conclave sensor buoys placed in human space were not just monitoring for safety purposes. They were surveillance tools. The Council was collecting data on human military development and sharing it with various parties for political purposes. So humanity had done what humanity does when it discovers someone is watching. They performed. For 31 years, every sensor reading in human space that the Conclave could see was a controlled piece of fiction. The fleet numbers were wrong. The weapon yield classifications were wrong. The psychological profiles were assembled from old, outdated behavioral studies that humans had deliberately left accessible. The defectors, who had provided personal testimony about human military weakness, were agents, every single one of them. The real fleet was elsewhere. The real weapons were in classified facilities that didn't appear on any map the Council could access. The real commanders had never been studied, because they had made sure they never would be. Director Mikhail Aborin ran the program from a small office on Ganymede. He was a quiet man who liked chess and grew tomatoes in a small planter on his windowsill. He had spent his career in the background, which was exactly where he wanted to be. When the intelligence file was transmitted to the Dracorvians, one of his analysts flagged it within hours. Aborin read the notification, poured himself a cup of tea, and allowed himself a small smile. They had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The Dracorvians built their entire invasion strategy around the file. They expected 400 human warships in the primary defense zone. There were 1,200. They expected weapons capped at Class IV plasma yield. The humans were fielding Class VII, 2 full classifications above what the Conclave had ever recorded. They expected a command structure that would fracture under sustained pressure, because the file said human commanders had a documented history of disagreement and independent action. What they got instead was a fleet that moved with an eerie, quiet coordination, the kind that comes not from rigid order but from people who have trained together so long they no longer need to speak to understand each other. Vethkaras launched the first wave with complete confidence. His ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in precise formation, ready to overwhelm the border defense stations the file had identified as undermanned and poorly armed. The stations were neither. The first wave lasted 11 minutes. Of the 68 Dracorvian vessels in that formation, 41 were destroyed outright and 17 were disabled. 10 managed to retreat. Vethkaras received the combat report on his bridge and read it 3 times, because the numbers did not match any projection his system had generated. He pulled up the intelligence file. He began reading from the beginning, this time looking for what he had missed. He was a methodical commander. It was why he had been chosen for this mission. He read carefully. He checked timestamps. He cross-referenced. 2 hours later, he set the file down. They had been fed false information. Not just slightly wrong information, completely fabricated information, built over decades, designed specifically to make an enemy overconfident. He had walked into a trap so old and so patient that it had been waiting for him before he was even assigned to this command. For a long moment, Vethkaras said nothing. His bridge crew moved around him, processing the disaster of the first engagement, waiting for orders. He stared at the star map showing human space, all 14 systems, which suddenly looked very different to him than they had an hour ago. He had studied humanity for 2 years. He thought he knew them. He realized now that he had studied only what they had allowed him to see. The real humanity, the one that had spent 30 years quietly, patiently building a lie for exactly this purpose, he had never studied at all. He had not even known to look. Aborin received word of the first engagement's outcome while watering his tomato plants. He read the report, set it on the desk, and went back to watering. Outside his window, Ganymede's surface stretched flat and gray under Jupiter's enormous light. He thought about the 31 years, all the careful work, all the people who had played their parts without ever breaking cover. He thought about the council, about Sorrel sitting in his crystal chamber, certain he had done the clever thing. He set the watering can down and sent one message up the chain. Phase 1 confirmed. They used it exactly as expected. Then he sat down, picked up his chess board, and began setting up the pieces for a new game. 8 months into the war, the Galactic Conclave convened an emergency closed session. No record of the meeting was officially kept, though several accounts would surface years later. What was certain was that, by the time the session ended, the Council had made a decision, and it was the worst decision they had ever made. The Dracorvian hegemony was losing. This had not been expected. The Council's projections, based on the same flawed data they had given to Vethkaras, had suggested the conflict would be over in 4 months with a human defeat. Instead, 8 months in, the hegemony had lost nearly a third of its forward fleet and 3 of its staging bases in the outer sectors. Vethkaras had gone from confident to cautious to something that looked, to those who knew Dracorvian body language, a great deal like fear. This was bad for business. Trade disruptions had spread to 7 major shipping corridors. 2 council members had lost significant revenue. Others were nervous about what a stronger, battle-hardened human military might mean for galactic politics in the long term. The mood in the council was not sympathetic to humanity. It was anxious about what humanity was becoming. Sorrel proposed a solution. A peace settlement brokered by the conclave presented to both sides, framed as a humanitarian gesture. The Dracorvians would agree to a ceasefire. In exchange, they would be given 4 of humanity's 14 star systems, including the Kepler colonies, as a territorial concession. No human was consulted. No human was in the room. No human was informed until after the vote passed. The document was marked confidential. It stayed that way for less than 2 days. Lena Vasquez, now Colonel Vasquez, serving in the Sol Defense Forces Intelligence Liaison Division, received the leaked document at 300-hour ship time. She read it standing in the narrow corridor outside her quarters in her socks, under a single strip of light. She read it once. Then she put her back against the wall and slid slowly down until she was sitting on the floor. The Kepler colonies held 900 million people, families, children, people who had built homes on those worlds and planted things in the ground and never asked for any of this. The Council had offered their lives to an enemy like a transaction, like a line item in a budget negotiation. She sat on that floor for 4 minutes. Then she stood up, put her boots on, and went to send the document to every human news network, government channel, and military command in the 14 systems. By morning, every human alive had seen it. What happened next surprised everyone, including, quietly, the humans themselves. For years, human space had been divided. The outer colonies resented Earth's central government. Independent fleet captains refused Sol Command's authority. Political factions that had been fighting each other for decades showed no sign of stopping. Human unity had always been the species' most obvious weakness, something every outside observer noted, including the conclave. When the partition document spread, all of that stopped. It did not stop gradually. It did not stop with negotiation or diplomacy or long political arguments. It stopped the way a storm stops, suddenly, completely, as if a switch had been turned. Every separatist colony, every independent fleet captain, every faction leader who had refused to answer Sol Command's calls for a generation, they all went silent. For exactly 1 hour, across 14 star systems, the human political landscape made no noise at all. Then simultaneously, from every direction, the same message arrived at Sol Command headquarters. We are reporting for unified duty, awaiting coordinates. Admiral Osimensa stood at the head of the war table when the messages came in. Her staff was reading them aloud as they arrived, one after another, then too fast to read aloud, filling the display board in a cascade of names and fleet numbers and coordinates. She watched the board fill up. She didn't say anything for a long time. Her second-in-command, Captain Rains, finally broke the silence. "Admiral," he said, "we now have the 3rd largest military force in the known galaxy, assembled in 72 hours. Osimensa looked at the board for another moment. "Get them positions," she said, "and somebody get Vasquez on the line." Vasquez was already composing a message, not to Sol Command, but directly to High Arbiter Sorrel. It was not a diplomatic message. She was not writing as an ambassador. She recorded it sitting in her small cabin, in her uniform, without notes. She looked into the camera. She said, "You should have defended us. If you had, we would have been grateful. And we would have remembered it. You chose not to, so now we are going to finish this ourselves." She paused for 1 second. "Please stay out of the way." The channel closed. Sora watched the recording in his private office, alone. When it ended, he sat without moving for a very long time. Outside the chamber windows, the crystal walls of the conclave building shimmered in colors that had no name, which was what they did when something happened that the building's ancient systems had no category for. He had spent 40 years thinking he understood humans. He had studied their history, their conflicts, their failures. He had looked at all the things that divided them and concluded that division was permanent, that it was written into their nature. He had never once considered what would happen if you gave them a reason to stop. The war changed after the Third Era. Not immediately, wars do not change immediately, but in the way that a river changes when a dam breaks. The water was the same water, but now it had direction. Human forces pushed into the outer conflict zones with a coordination that Dracorvian commanders had not seen in 8 months of fighting. It was not just the numbers, though the numbers were overwhelming. It was something harder to quantify, a quality in the way human ships moved, the way human captains made decisions, the way human soldiers held positions that should have broken. Veth-Karas had studied enough warfare to recognize what he was seeing. He had fought 32 civilizations. Some of them had been technically superior to his forces. Some had been numerically superior. But there was a type of fighting that came from something beyond training or technology, a type that emerged when a people were no longer just defending territory, but defending something they could not put into words. He had seen it once before in a civilization called the Varath 3 centuries ago. The Varath had fought that way for 11 years before finally being overwhelmed. He was not sure he had 11 years. On the ground, in the stations and corridors and pressurized colonies where the close-range fighting happened, it was the human soldiers who showed most clearly what the Council had never understood. They did not fight cleanly. They did not fight efficiently. They fought the way people fight when losing is not an option they have accepted, with an adaptability and a refusal and a stubbornness that had no tactical name. At Kepler 7 station, a garrison of 400 humans was surrounded and cut off for 40 days. They had limited ammunition, a damaged life support system, and no realistic path to relief. Every strategic model said they should surrender on day 12. On day 40, when human reinforcements finally broke through, the garrison commander, a young lieutenant named Park, walked out of the station with all 400 of her people still alive, having used Dracorvian weapons they had captured, jury-rigged their own equipment 3 times, and at one point repelled a boarding attempt with pressurized atmosphere vented through maintenance shafts. The story spread across all 14 systems in hours. It became something more than a military event. It became a symbol, which is a thing the Conclave had never accounted for, because symbols cannot be tracked on a tactical display and you cannot shoot them. Human engineers, working in captured Dracorvian staging areas, began taking apart enemy equipment to understand it. Within 3 weeks, they were building hybrid systems, human architecture fused with Dracorvian components, that outperformed both originals. Veth-Karas received reports of his own weapons being used against his own ships and had no response to offer his command staff that felt adequate. He was a practical man. He had always known when a war was lost. He had ended campaigns before. It was not a failure to him, it was a calculation. He opened a private channel and sent a message to Admiral Osei directly, bypassing all formal protocols. He offered a quiet withdrawal. His forces would pull back to pre-war positions. Humanity could have the contested territory. He would recommend to the Hegemony Council that reparations be discussed. He expected a counteroffer. That was how these things went. Osei reply arrived in under an hour. It was one sentence. "Return our people, dismantle your forward bases, then we'll talk." Veth-Karas read it. He read it again. There was no counteroffer, no territory demands beyond what was already human, no financial demands, no performance of victory, just two conditions stated plainly with the clear understanding that they were not the beginning of a negotiation. They were the precondition for one. He set the message down and looked out at the stars through his bridge viewport. He had been a fleet commander for 30 years. He had negotiated the ends of wars before, long, complicated ends with many parties and much ceremony. This was the first time an enemy had made it sound so simple. He began drafting the withdrawal orders. It took him less time than he expected. He found, to his own surprise, that he felt something close to relief. In the Dracorvian prisoner facilities on 3 different worlds, human prisoners of war were processed for release. One young Dracorvian guard, assigned to a human POW facility for 4 months, had spent that time watching his prisoners with the careful attention of someone who knows they are seeing something they were not taught to understand. On his last shift, someone had left a tablet loaded with a documentary about human history, the wars they fought among themselves, the near-total destructions they had survived, the centuries of suffering they had caused each other and lived through and somehow continued past. He watched it for 2 hours. When it ended, he sat quietly for a moment. "And they still won," he said, to no one in particular. A human guard who was passing paused. She had heard him. She did not turn around. "We always do," she said, and kept walking. The war ended the way a human fist opens, not with drama, but with a steady, deliberate unclenching. There was no ceremony of surrender, no public humiliation, no parade of defeated ships through human space for broadcast across the galaxy. Admiral Osei Mensa had been clear with her commanders from the moment the Dracorvian withdrawal began. There would be no cruelty. There would be no performances. The humans had won. That was enough. That was more than enough. A treaty was drafted not by conclave mediators, not by diplomatic committees, but by human lawyers and military advisors who had been working on it in quiet preparation for 3 months. It was precise. It was fair. Every clause was documented and grounded in law. It returned all human territory, established a buffer zone, set clear terms for reparations, and created a monitoring framework that required both sides to comply. It gave the Dracorvian hegemony 30 days to sign. They signed it in 11. When news reached the Galactic Conclave, the chamber was different from how it had been 18 months ago, at the vote that started everything. The crystal walls, which had been pale and cold that day, were now cycling through colors in a slow, uncertain pattern that the older council members had never seen before. It meant, as the building's original architects had designed, that the assembled species did not know what to feel. Species that had abstained from the defense vote sat in their seats and said very little. The usual undercurrent of casual arrogance that ran through council sessions, the quiet sense that the older civilizations had seen all of this before and understood it better, was absent. In its place was something rare in that chamber, genuine uncertainty. High Arbiter Sorrel requested a private meeting with General Vasquez. She had been promoted twice since re-enlisting. The meeting was held in a small room adjacent to the main chamber, with no observers and no official record. Sorrel sat across from her, and for the first time in his career, spoke to a human without the practiced patience of someone explaining something to a child. He told her that the conclave wished to formally readmit humanity to full membership, not provisional, not conditional, full voting rights, a permanent seat on the Defense Council, and on the official record, an apology for the partition proposal and for the failures of the defense vote. Vasquez listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that humanity would accept the seat, but there were conditions. She slid a document across the table. It was not a list of demands for humanity's benefit. There were no requests for special status or expanded territory or political advantage. What Sorrel read working through it slowly and carefully. Was a complete restructuring proposal for the conclave itself. New mandatory defense obligations for all member species. No more abstentions when a member was under military threat. A binding clause against intelligence sharing with hostile parties. A new tier system that gave provisional members stronger protections during their early years of membership. An independent oversight body, staffed by rotating representatives from low-tier species, with the authority to challenge council decisions. Humanity was not joining the old conclave. They were proposing a new one. Sorrel finished reading. He set the document on the table and kept his hands flat on it for a moment. His secondary breathing slits, small slits along his neck that most species never noticed, moved slightly, a tell that his kind could not control under stress. He looked at Vasquez. She looked back at him with the steady patience of someone who has already decided that the answer will be yes, and is simply waiting for the other person to understand that too. "This will take time," he said finally. "We know," she said. "We're good at waiting." The full council session was called 3 weeks later. The proposal was presented. The debate was long. Some of the older species objected, as expected. Some objected loudly. But in that chamber, something had shifted. The votes that had once been so easy to predict were no longer easy. Species that had always followed the majority now paused. Species that had never spoken in defense of younger members now did. It passed. Not unanimously. Nothing in the conclave ever passed unanimously. But it passed with a margin that no one who knew the council's history would have believed possible a year before. Admiral Osai was not in the chamber for the vote. She was on the observation deck of the TSS Unyielding, in orbit above Earth, watching the planet turn slowly below her. Africa was moving through the morning light. The Indian Ocean was very blue. She had grown up in Accra, in a neighborhood that smelled like red dust and rain, and she could not see it from here, but she knew the direction it was in, and she looked that way. Her junior communications officer, Ensign Chitty, appeared at the top of the stairs. He was young, 23, maybe 24, and he had that look young officers get when they want to say something but are not sure if they should. "The vote passed, Admiral," he said. She nodded. She already knew. Word traveled fast. "What do you think the council will say?" he asked. When they read the full implementation plan, the part about the new oversight body. Osai was quiet for a moment. The planet turned below them. A thin line of light crept across the ocean's edge. "Same thing they always said about us," she replied. She turned and walked back inside.